Douglas Murray, congratulations on the new book, The Madness of Crowds, Gender, Race, and Identity. I love the cover, by the way. It really captures that kind of mass hysteria look. And of course, your title echoes it's a swarm. That's right. Your title echoes one of the most famous books in the history of the skeptical movement, the extraordinary popular delusions in the madness of crowds, which you acknowledge in your introduction. I wanted to say before we get into it, I believe I found the end of wokeness today in today's newspaper. Here's the Los Angeles Times headline: Sports. Money talks and Maury walks. This is the NBA walking back one of their general managers.
Now you're going to have to walk me through that.
Okay, so the NBA is the National Basketball Association is considered the most woke of all the American sports, and they always condemn racism and misogyny, and they come down hard on their players when they act out and so forth. And so one of their general managers tweeted yesterday support for the Hong Kong democracy movement.
Oh, yes.
And the NBA has, well, I'll give you the numbers here. They have made inroads into China, and China's favorite sport is basketball. And they are able to deliver no less than 300 million players and 500 million viewers. So the NBA decided that wasn't such a good idea to support Hong Kong democracy movement. So their wokeness came up against their bottom line, and guess what won? So this guy...
I saw that South Park, however, maintained a proper and strong stance on this.
Yes, they did. Well, yeah, they don't care. But maybe they're not big enough. I don't know. So this guy, Daryl Murray here, tweets out afterwards. He deleted his tweet and said, "I did not intend my tweet to cause any offense to the Rocket fans and friends of mine here in China. I was merely voicing one thought based on one interpretation of one complicated event. I have had a lot of opportunity since that tweet to hear and consider other perspectives." This is so classic.
It reminds me of the late American Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Remember his rule and law about human rights violations, that you hear about human rights violations in exactly inverse proportion to actual human rights violations occurring, because we just don't hear about them in countries which are really violating human rights. And there's something like that going on with this, isn't there? It's like celebrities and large multinationals and corporations and everyone else who wants to play the sort of woke game actually can only do it against America or Britain. It doesn't work with China.
Right.
Russia doesn't care. And these people end up only doing it against the better states.
Right. Where their freedoms are protected, they're free to then protest the lack of freedom in the country where they're the most free.
Yeah.
I see it as kind of a sign of moral progress. Also, when the Yale University brouhaha over the Halloween costumes erupted a couple of years ago with Nicholas Christakis, I thought, boy, how far have we come where you're left with protesting Halloween costumes as opposed to my generation that protested the Vietnam War and other, obvious Jim Crow inequities in the South and so forth in that. And speaking of which, here is a second a newspaper headline: San Francisco school's mural is subject of a lawsuit. Okay, this is a kind of a big famous story here in California. This mural was painted in the 1930s on the side of this building in a school, and it's called The Life of Washington. So it portrays George Washington with some of the founding fathers. It has some slaves. It has a dead Native American and so on. So the woke people went crazy over this mural, and they were just about to paint over it, and then lawsuits were filed to prevent the painting over it. Well, the new twist in today's article is that the mural was painted by Viktor Arnautoff, one of the foremost muralists of the Bay Area during the Depression. New Deal scholars have argued that Arnautoff, a Russian-born communist and social critic, depicts unsavory aspects of American history in a critical light. Right. But as early as the 1960s, some people started complaining. In other words, he painted that as a critique of American racism and injustice and inequity in the 1930s. And so now you can't even you can't even be critical of the things that the woke community is critical of, because just talking about it gives them oxygen or something.
Yes, no, there is so much in all of this, isn't there? I mean, the presumption. I said this about the statue pulling down in the UK, because we had it with Rhodes around the same time as you had it in America. But there are sort of basic misunderstandings, one feels, are at play. You know, misunderstanding about what a mural is and what things from the past are. Like that statues aren't things we venerate or worship necessarily. They're just things that happen to have been left over from the past that sometimes speak to us, sometimes don't, sometimes become totally obscure, and sometimes are indeed sort of lost to history. But it's a very strange set of misunderstandings that seems to be going along on this, as if we do actually need to get the past in strict order with our current values.
Values, as you pointed out, that were determined a week ago Tuesday.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then applied centuries back, digging up people out of the grave to excoriate them for their racisms.
I knew that mural was in trouble the minute you said that the founding fathers were in. I was like, whoa, that mural doesn't stand a chance.
Yeah. So the new book is a kind of a sequel to your Strange Death of Europe that dealt with the problem of immigration. By the way, my wife is from Cologne, Germany. And so she witnessed some of this when the borders were opened up and we would go back. She's been in America with me for about 5 years, but we go back a couple times a year. And the Christmas markets right downtown Cologne near the Dome, where the train station is, there was a lot of issues with some of the Muslim immigrants, mostly young men. And I remember thinking at the time, is this really that ideological, that these guys are down there stirring up trouble and, grabbing women and so on? I mean, is this, how ideological is something like that versus just a bunch of young drunken men out looking to stir things up and grab women's asses and things like that?
Well, there was an MP in the UK who, after the Cologne New Year's Eve assaults, when, as you know, 1,500 women were assaulted in one night, there was an MP in the UK, a very progressive left-wing figure called Jess Phillips, who was asked about this on the main BBC programme and said, rather memorably, it's no worse than an average Saturday night in Birmingham. And I sort of find that sort of thing fascinating, because what it is actually, it's a demonstration of our inability to look at new challenges or things we've become bad at dealing with, which we just aren't used to dealing with anymore, and our desperation to see everything as basically a continuation of some norm we have at the moment, and to say it's nothing strange, nothing new, don't bother looking at this. We've had a lot of examples of that. We had them in the UK, very similar things actually in Rotherham, Rochdale, and other places where really terrible things turned out to be unearthed, but that the immediate impression that people in authority had was, let's pretend it's nothing new or different. It's just what we've always had. And I was just always struck by the lack of curiosity, honesty, and general interest in trying to deal with problems that denotes. Because it doesn't seem to me that hard to say, look, we have had, we do have sexual abuse going on in our societies. There are people who commit crimes, obviously, but that doesn't mean that something like the Cologne attacks are just to be sort of brushed away as if it's just that. But, all our politicians struggle with this, as our societies do.
But had it been a group of unruly white supremacist skinheads in Cologne, Germany, I suspect the response would have been different. Because we know the program we run when that happens. That's the thing I'm so struck with. I'm very struck with it when a sort of, some white far right, neo-Nazi type does something. Like our program is pretty well run on that. We know what to do. It's not like it's like if somebody does something in the name of, I don't know, Jesus, and goes and guns a load of people down. It's not like the churches have a long time trying to work out what stance they should take about this maniac. Right.
We know how to deal with that, and that just isn't the case with some of the Islamist stuff, it's just not the case. We're very bad at it because it's quite new. We're still struggling to find a reasonable way to address it, and so we just duck it societally.
Yeah. The problem you identify in the madness of crowds really, I think, has arisen maybe since about 2015 or so. The madness kind of took off then. And people like Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff have tried to figure out, what's the cause of this? Is it they accuse the sort of coddling of baby boomers' children's, or maybe millennials' kids in the 1990s, kids born after 1995 are the iGeners, and they've been coddled. They've been kind of taken too well care of, and they don't have much resiliency, so they fall apart when they get encounter any of these kinds of discriminations or whatever. But I'm not so sure about that. There's other theories about this, maybe too much social media, too much screen time, and there's conflicting research on that. What are your thoughts about sort of the background and cause and rise of this madness?
I mean, yeah, Haidt and Lukianoff, I think, are completely right in show, and I show a similar thing, that this what we're really talking about with the sort of social justice warriorism, the intersectionalism going from the fringes of academia into the mainstream of society, and not just society, I mean, into every corporation, into major businesses, into the human resources departments of, Fortune 500 companies, into government, this sort of thing. This really happens in the last 10 years, and it's in the last 5 years it becomes highly weaponized, and massively so after the election in 2016 in America and the referendum in 2016 in the UK, when very similar playbooks occurred to push back against those by people who disliked and disapproved of those results. I think there's several things. I think obviously the sort of helicopter parenting aspect is one bit. One aspect which I try to bring out in the introduction to The Madness of Crowds, which I just think is too little dwelt upon, is that we know in history that when the economics goes bad, other things happen. And when the economics went bad in our societies in 2008, we continued as if that wouldn't have an impact. And I think it does have an impact. As I say, I think in the introduction to The Madness of Crowds, it's not obvious why a young person who sees no opportunity to accumulate capital would just love capitalism because they were told to. And equally, I understand why somebody who thinks they will never own a property of their own might be vaguely or very interested in a value system that claims that it is within its capability to solve and address every inequity on earth. The appeal is fairly clear.
Yeah.
And I do think that a lot of that is this. And just one other thing I'd point out from that, which is that, again, I think that one of the things that happens when the economics goes bad is that people lose trust in the adults in the room, and the adults in the room lose some faith in themselves, and with reason, with good reason. And that one of the ways you could see this massive weaponization and this breathing in of all this ideology in the last 10 years is as some kind of payback by the adults, some kind of expiation or some down payment for the mistakes they visibly were seen to have made.
Yeah, you have a quote there in the introduction from the CNN presenter. There might be an overcorrection, but that's okay. We're due for a correction.
Yeah.
So it's almost like Dr. King's gradual, slow, nonviolent moral progress through the 50s, 60s, and 70s feels too slow now for the iGeners. Maybe they want it tomorrow, because they're used to these kinds of revolutions happening much faster. If you compare the, say, same-sex marriage debate versus feminism versus civil rights, boy, it happened overnight. So maybe that's the new expectation.
Yes, and I think a view of life as being meaningful if it involves endless struggle. I mean, this isn't new, as you know.
Right,
I mean,
right.
This is as old as human being. The desire to struggle, the desire to find meaning in that, and in our current age, it's as attractive, if not more attractive than ever, because it's something to do when otherwise we're not sure what we're meant to be doing. I mean, this is to me such a key thing. So many young people I speak to have so much ability, so much potential, so much access to information, but fundamentally they're not sure what they're meant to be doing. Like, how are they meant to spend their lives? What is it? What is the purpose? Now, that's not a new question, but I am struck in societies like modern America and modern Britain that almost nothing speaks into that void. One of the only things that does speak into the void is this presentation of meaning in life coming through constant activism. And it's inevitable, just one other thing, if I may, which is it's inevitable in that situation as well that there would be some advantage in presenting rights as never having been worse at the point at which they've never been better.
Right.
Because you want to be, as I cite the late Australian political philosopher Ken Minogue, you want to be St. George slaying the dragon. You don't want to be somebody way down the road from St. George, strangling a sort of ant or something. You want the heroic mode.
Right.
You want the enormous veneration that your peers would give you if you'd been at the Stonewall Inn, if you'd been with Dr. Martin Luther King in the March on Washington, if you'd been a first wave feminist or a suffragette, and we do admire these people. Of course we do, because they brought amazing progress and social progress. But if that fight is not there anymore, it seems at least incredibly tempting to be portraying yourself as involved in precisely that fight, whilst involved in minor traffic issues, really.
Yeah. This brings to mind a quote from George Orwell I cited in my book, Heavens on Earth, and my chapter on utopian. The utopian quest for perfect happiness was exposed as the flawed goal that it is by George Orwell in his 1940 review of Mein Kampf, when the journalist and critic observed that Hitler, quote, has grasped the falsity of the hedonistic attitude to life. And then, whereas most progressives and liberals after the Great War had come to believe that people want only a life free from pain and strife, Orwell noted that Hitler understood that people want more than just, quote, comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene, birth control, and in general common sense. They also, at least intermittently, want struggle and self-sacrifice.
And isn't it exactly?
Yeah, go ahead.
Isn't it fascinating as well that there is this thing that once again it seems to be in part a backlash against perceived libertinism.
Right.
One of the most striking things about the intersectional movement once it gets weaponized is that it becomes puritanical. One of the things I try to demonstrate, as you know, I do these issues one by one in The Madness of Crowds: gay, women, race, and trans. But one of the things I try to show in the women chapter in particular is that, men and women have been able to get on for an awfully long time. And it seems wise to try to ensure, I don't have a dog in this fight, but it seems wise to try to ensure that the conditions are good for them to continue to get along in some way. And one of the things that's so striking about the counter move of recent years has been the presentation of almost all male and female, male on female, female on male sexual activity as being basically inappropriate, unless it is the 100% accuracy rating bullseye that is permitted in the puritanical SJW culture.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you have a interlude on Marxism. I think that was after the gay chapter. Is that after the? Yeah,
as you know, between each chapter, I do these interludes to try to explain the substructure.
Yeah, I like that. So, talk about Marxism and postmodernism and how they're different. A lot of people like Jordan Peterson, our mutual friend, as you know, fingers postmodernism a lot and Marxism, but critics have pointed out these are two different things. I mean, the sort of the postmodern challenge or skepticism of grand narratives, that's what liberalism is all about. We tackle the grand narrative of the Christian worldview or the Marxist worldview on the other side. So these do seem different. What do you see the role of Marxism in all this?
Yes, there's quite an interesting discussion on the American, I think particularly on the American right in recent years about this, about trying to sort of make sure that the Marxist and postmodernist strands don't get completely enmeshed. and that we're able to understand which bit comes from where in the Frankfurt School and so on. I think it's a very interesting discussion, because it's undeniable that these are separate strains, but it's also undeniable that they're related. I go into the issue with Foucault because quite clearly you can't address some of these issues without going to thinkers like Foucault, separate as they are from some of the other thinkers of their time who have ended up being almost as significant. But it does seem to me that a lot of that post-war, particularly European thought at the outset, has become enmeshed and melded in a way that means that possibly down the line people will see it as being one phenomenon. I mean, just as we do now with different schools of thought of recent centuries, it ends up being a scholarship game to pull them apart. And one of the things I'm struck by the way, is the amount of effort and the amount of attention that has been paid by really serious and significant figures, you and I both know, to trying to unpick which bit of which strand in the postmodernism and the Marxism did what, when in a way that might not have turned out to have been the most efficient thing to have spent our time doing. I mean, I'm very struck by critics of, for instance, romanticism, who you can still find. I know there's a very distinguished one at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and I'm fascinated by these intellectual archaeology games and the effort to sort of unpick exactly where a particular thing went wrong. The only thing I would say is that one of the striking things about the free run that I think that the intersectionalists have had is precisely because their critics have decided to engage in that form of unpicking archaeological excavation. And whilst they were doing so, the whole of the race through the culture of this ideology occurred. And I'm so struck by that, that it's a very important game, but it doesn't actually meet the challenge of what is happening head on. It almost ignores it.
You've got
because it's clearly not going to fall apart by working out which strand went wrong where. Interesting exercise though it is.
Yeah, I mean, I embrace some of the postmodernism in as much as I like challenging the grand narratives, like the Christian worldview, for example. You and I are both atheists. But on the other hand, when you get to the point where there's no truth and science is just another narrative story, therefore my theory that the Holocaust didn't happen is as good as yours that it did, usually they back off at that point.
Yeah, they still have holy places. I mean, and understandably so. It's very hard to live without that.
Now, you are often characterized as a gay atheist conservative, so you check two of the intersectional boxes if you count atheism as an oppressed minority. I'm not sure it is anymore.
Oppressed? I'm not sure.
I don't know. As an atheist, I live in Southern California, so pretty much anything goes here, so there's not a lot of oppression. I suppose if I lived in the deep South, it might be different. I don't know how it is for you. If you write a chapter in The Madness of Crowds on gay, and you're gay, so that kind of gives you some cred. You say stuff that I don't think I'd be comfortable saying because I'm straight. By the way, I learned something new. I had no idea about the camel toe. Yeah, for women, and my wife says it took a gay guy to explain to you what the camel toe is. I'm like, oh, this is embarrassing. But of course, that's in your chapter on women and some of the things that women do to apparently appeal to men, to be attracted to men, to make heads turn, as you said. But wouldn't the feminist critique of that, maybe the third wave feminist critique of that, be say, well, these women are brainwashed by the patriarchy to think like that?
Of course. Of course. I mean, I should say, listeners, that yes, I do gay first, partly because it's the one on which I try to demonstrate, if I'm willing to, because I want to show on each of these cases that we're driving ourselves mad because we're making these identity issues the basis for everything, including all of our morality, all of our identity, and much more. Basically, the basis of our metaphysical system. I think that's very unwise for reasons that I demonstrate throughout the book. But I do gay first to say, look, I'm willing to show why gay is not that stable an entity. Why it isn't a good time it isn't a good idea to lean as heavily as we are now leaning on it. And I do it first, apart from anything else, to show that I'm willing to do that on something that affects me, and therefore I want to show that we should, each of us, be able to have the reasonable conversations about the interesting and important elements of this without saying, oh my gosh, you're treading all over my identity and my sacred places. And yes, the women one is fascinating because there are dynamics that the gay chapter opens out, which then, as you know, are very prominent in the female one. And the main one is this issue of power. Is this we have imbibed such a ludicrous set of propositions in recent years, and they come down in brief to the fact that we pretend to be certain about things we don't know about, and we pretend to not know anything about things everyone knew till yesterday. And into that latter camp, I put the whole issue of relations between the sexes, which are complex, but are not as complex as we are currently making them. And one of the ways I try to open this out, as you know, is to say we are looking at the entire world through this terrible sort of Foucaultian power paradigm, as if that is the only force in the world. And if we do, let's play that game for a bit. Why have we then decided that there is only one form of power in the world, and that is sort of white, elderly, cis, male, heteronormative power? Why don't we have the courage to admit other forms of power exist? For instance, are there forms of power that a very beautiful young woman can wield, that a very old white male, for instance, might not be able to wield? Now, everyone knows the answer to that is yes. Yes, of course. But we've been colluding in a lie in recent years, because it's just like the gay thing. It's easier not to have that conversation because the conversation is harder than we've been presenting it in recent years. You know, I quote somebody at one point in the women chapter who says, you know, it's not that complicated about a specific thing about workplace relations. I think, well, obviously it is quite complicated because we've made it almost derangingly complicated.
Yeah, and Jordan Peterson, as you quote in the book, got in trouble for just asking the question. Well, he was asked, you know, can women wear makeup? Well, I don't know. Can they? Yeah. You know, just suggesting we should have a conversation about that. So talk a little bit about your interlude on tech with women and the whole Jamie Damore, Google memo debacle and all that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I spent quite a bit of time in Silicon Valley in recent years and spoken to a lot of people in the tech industry. And I'm just very struck by the fact that, what I try to demonstrate is that they appear to be, well, several things. One, as you well know, is that clearly Silicon Valley is some way to the left of the average liberal arts campus in the US. And in some way, I mean, it is alarming, and we do know about some of this now, but I submit that we're not quite as alarmed as we should be, because again, a lot of the derangement that I try to show has been going on in recent years has been going on because Silicon Valley has been feeding us a sped up version of something that certain newspapers and media have also been trying to feed us, but they can't do it in the super quick time that Silicon Valley can. So, for instance, I show at one point in the gay chapter, you know, the weird, I say maybe it needs a gay person to say this, but the weird gaying of all news in some way. So that there have been periods, particularly, say, post-2016, where there have been inexplicably gay news stories. I mean, stories that would not make the news if it wasn't to do with the crowbarring and of something to do with being gay. And I give examples of this. The business pages of the New York Times, inexplicably, long stories about a gay Japanese businessman who comes out and it's not a problem. But why is that the main news story in business?
Right.
And one of the things I try to show is that particularly since 2016, you can see that Silicon Valley is doing a sped up version of a thing that the media is also doing, which is something I think along the lines of the following. We've decided that we know who the enemy is. We've decided that we know who the bigots are. The bigots are this white, cis, heteronormative, patriarchal males in particular, and we are going to sock it to them. And just as the BBC and the New York Times and others seem to be very keen to do this through the planting of particular stories, in the tech companies, they do it through, among other things, of course, search results. And that's one of the things I wanted to show in this. And I mean, the response already to people who've read that book, part of the book, has been, "Oh my God!"
Yeah.
I mean, people don't believe till they see it. The way in which the search engines deliberately don't give you what you want if you are somebody they suspect of being of the wrong opinions.
So I did what you suggested in the book. I Googled straight couples, and of course, 3/4 of them are gay couples. And so I posted that on Twitter, and I got some pushback, as you might imagine. What does this prove? It's like, well, it's what Douglas is saying, is that, you know, the tech companies are gearing up toward this. But on the other hand, if you type in heterosexual couples, you get straight couples instead of gay couples, and so maybe it depends on. No. Sometimes some of them you do more than others. Straight couples is the most alarming. Well, gay couples, as you say, yes, you get gay couples, happy gay couples. Straight couples. You get gay couples, and the same thing happens on searching along racial lines. So if you want to find on the Google search the Asian couples one, you get what you asked for. Whereas if you ask for white couples, you don't. And the point is that there's this very clear pattern in this, which is, as I say, like the New York Times view, they've sort of identified who the bad people are and the sort of thing they would be searching for. And they've decided not to give those people what they are asking for. And I mean, there are many, many other versions of this, of course, that we now know from Silicon Valley, from the way that Twitter has chosen to operate in recent years, to the way in which funding platforms like Patreon have chosen to operate. And I think that this is all got to be taken as one, that this is all part of the derangement we're going through, because Silicon Valley is particularly keen to fast track this new metaphysical system that's only been going for a very short amount of time, to fast track it into the mainstream. And I think it's obviously going to have a large impact on younger people. And it's obviously going to continue to derange those people, but it's particularly going to derange older people who just can't understand what's going on. Yeah, Sunday night on 60 Minutes, the big television news program here, they featured a episode on tech and farming, and that American farmers are struggling because of Trump's tariff wars with China and bad weather and so on and so forth. But they're going to recover because they have all this great tech. So they have like satellite images of the farm soil, and you could tell which are depleted from nitrogen or whatever just from these satellite photos. They have these camera images of every single cow in the field as if it's a facial identity thing, and they can tell how much he weighs and what nutrients he needs and so on. But halfway through the story, they introduce the woman who's in charge of all this tech stuff. And then about 3/4 of the way through, they go, and by the way, she's gay. It's like, whoa, okay, what's this got to do with farming and tech? Well, because farming is traditionally a male, masculine, patriarchy thing. Now women have finally gone into farming, and now guess what? Gay women can be in farming. It's like, whoa,
this is the intersexual equivalent of being told to have your 5 fruit and veg a day. It's
right.
It's have a daily dose of gay, daily dose of fourth wave feminism, daily dose of some racial thing. And, if we keep doing this, I mean, there are so many examples on the on interracial advertising and so on. And all of it comes. This is one of the problems from this, is that it all comes from a good place, which is at its origin, which is the good place is, of course, none of us want somebody who has a competency in something to be put off fulfilling their potential because historically people like them didn't appear to dominate in that particular field.
Right.
If a girl in her, at the age of 12 is really good at physics and wants to be in physics when she grows up, and she looks at Google images. And this is one of the examples, by the way, that Google uses is, it's understandable that you might want to help her realize that since a lot of the physicists who come up are dead white males, you don't have to be a dead white male to be a physicist.
Right.
But there are ways of doing that without lying about the past. And there are ways of doing that do not involve this force feeding of the 5 good fruit and veg a day intersectionalism on us, where now you can predict with absolute certainty what's going to be force fed us with this sort of thing. It's going to have to be a woman in a job that was expected to be that of a man. Everybody's got to be gay.
Right.
And at some point, what I think we have to work out here, and this is one of the things I've challenged my critics on, is how about seeing that if we agreed that some of this starts in a good place, as some of it does, how about first of all saying, is it possible that we're going through an overcorrection on some of this?
Yeah.
And if we are, why don't we try to have a respectful conversation about how we would know when the overcorrection has gone on long enough? Who would call time, and how would we get back to equal? One of the things that's so fascinating in each of the chapters, each of the issues I go into here, is I think to some degree, not in every case, let alone worldwide, but to some degree in societies like ours, each rights movement has moved in part past equal and on to better. And in that case, if you identify those places where it's presented as being better to be gay than to be straight, better to be a woman than to be a man, worse always to be white, for instance, horrible as it is to say that, but there are certainly situations that arises. If that is the case, then why don't we try to identify them, work out where the rights movement has gone to better, and agree on how we can get back to equal?
Yeah. Well, I think that is part of the overcorrection process that we're going through. And I think it can only backfire by just saying, whites are inferior. How are we going to move forward with that kind of attitude? Right. In your gay and chapter and trans chapter, in the gay chapter, you talked about this push for biologically determined homosexuality so that it's not a lifestyle choice, so you can't be more punished for your moral indiscretions there. I remember when this was unfolding in the 90s, and I had a lecture series at Caltech I was hosting, and I had Simon LeVay speak for us, and he had just published this paper on the hippocampus of gays versus the hippocampus of straights. Oh. And that you could tell, he had the slide up there. And he goes, you can clearly see here that the hippocampus of the gays are different, and we're all looking like, where? What? And, I mean, we all wanted it to be true. Yeah, there's some biological, physical difference. You were just born that way, and Lady Gaga, yeah, born that way, okay, because that kind of squelches the conservative Christians, accusation of a moral lifestyle choice that is wrong and so forth. But then you said we still don't really know. I haven't looked at this in years. I thought the behavior genetics studies and so on indicated that that there's a good argument for some biological substrate to homosexuality. Yeah.
Well, actually, I mean, I was nervous about this chapter, perhaps more than some of the others, because reopening this can of worms, some people said to me, just please don't do it, Douglas. But I think it's fascinating because I don't like lies being embedded in a society just for short-term gain. And yes, it made total sense to argue against a lifestyle choice, which everyone realized was sort of clearly erroneous, quite an easy level to actually show, because if it was a lifestyle choice, why would people choose it when it made their lifestyle so much harder for such a long time? There was something inbuilt that was clearly false about that. But the leaning on Born This Way, the Lady Gaga option as being the answer, seemed to me also to be to be relying on a little bit of untruth. What I submit in that chapter, I'm not definite about it because I don't think we can be definite. And one of the things I think we have to try to practice is being uncertain about things again in our society, being confident enough that we don't need to assert things we don't know. And so I, as you know, think there's significant evidence that there is something hardware about it. I use the hardware software analogy throughout the book, as you know, that there's something hardware about it, but it's probably got more of a software element that we've been willing to admit in recent years. And I was relieved, I have to say, when the largest study to date of gay men and women was released only 3 weeks before publication of The Madness of Crowds. It was published in Science magazine, that pretty much completely vindicated the stance I've explained on this, and said there is still, as I say, no evidence of a gay gene. And I suspect we'll never find such a gene. I've discussed this with biologist friends, and it seems quite unlikely for all sorts of reasons. But that there is some kind of genetic predisposition certainly seems possible. But the bit of it that is definitely the bit that people are most nervous about, which I talk about, and which, as I say, the study published in Science also addresses, but doesn't drill down into more detail on because we just don't know yet, is what environmental factors might also play a part. But of course, that is terrifying for people,
right?
Because then you're,
Well, then you go down the road to, parenting and, I should have taken him to more sports games and idiotic arguments like that.
Right. Or the one, as you know, I go in the book, I describe going to a voluntary gay conversion film shown, and I mentioned there that one of the Christian doctors who's a star of this film mentions that one of the things one might do to avoid homosexual feelings is, for instance, to do healthy things like going to a gym. And I say, well, clearly that doctor's never gone to a male gym, but there you go.
And what is your sense of the percentage of the population, just say in the Western world that we know of, identify as gay? And let's leave trans out for a minute because I want to go to that next. I mean, and also gay and lesbian, or
the figures are pretty constant. It's less than 5%. I mean, I think you're like 3-4%, somewhere around that. It's always exaggerated by gay activists. It's something like that. And by the way, one of the interesting things, feedback of people reading this book, because I do gay first, the number of straight friends who just want to get onto the women chapter,
right?
but who say to me, having read the gay chapter, I had no idea there was so few people were gay.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, what did you think it was? And like, I don't know, 40%.
Yeah. Right.
Well,
right.
But and there is something in that it has been overstated. Its predominance. I mean, there are also various cultural reasons why that's the case. But yeah, I mean, that's a real minority issue where women obviously isn't and race obviously isn't. But then you get onto the trans one, which I do last, as you know, which I show is a real minority of a minority issue. But that one's fascinating in a way particularly because we've lent on it so hard in recent years, whilst being so uncertain about it. I mean, we know masses about gay compared to trans. I mean, what we know about trans is almost nothing. Almost nothing.
Right.
And there's not even very many guesses in the medical community about it. There are sort of some feelings about what it might be, but broadly speaking, for the last 40 years, the view has remained that there are some people who seem to have a different idea of what sex they are than their bodies are, and that since you can't change the brain, it's easier to change the body. But there's been, again, a lot of hope put in the idea that we'll discover this is a hardware issue, and that, if you study the brains of trans people after they die, you can find that they're different. But that work hasn't really gone anywhere either. And, I think one of the things I try to urge, really, and just looking at these things as frankly and I think humanely as possible, is just to say we do have to be slightly less confident and assertive about some of the things we don't know about. And we really, I mean, the one that comes down to, of course, is we really don't know enough to experiment on children.
Especially surgical and chemical experimentation. There was a article in the paper yesterday of surgeons being called on to reverse trans surgeries. This may be a new industry. Wow.
And by the way, I mean, I as you know, in the trans chapter, among other things, relate an interview I had with a young man who did start to transition to being a woman and stopped before surgery, but still has all of the things that happened from taking the various drugs that he took for 2 years or so. And it's not a doozy, you know. It's not a completely easy thing to go through just that. And I am very struck by these detransition stories because, apart from the fact I see in the future a huge number of lawsuits coming certain people's ways, but I also think that it's a very interesting case, isn't it? Because those of us who are sort of, you know, free speech types. Sometimes people say, you know, that it's all either a cover for bigotry or it's some abstract thing which, you know, you have to rehearse Mill every few years again. And I have to say, I'm really struck by the fact that this story that you mentioned of just the last day is a demonstration of why the kind of free thinking and free speech which I try to exercise in this book, as in previous ones, is necessary. Because you know, I don't think we would be at that case of young people having really ruined their bodies if we had have been able to have the conversation we should have had by now about the trans.
Right.
You know?
Again, it's that attack on identity. This was a powerful sentence in your conclusion. It has been estimated that roughly 80% of children diagnosed with what is now called gender dysphoria will find that this problem resolves itself during puberty. That is, they will come to feel at ease with the biological sex they were identified with at birth. A majority of these children will grow up to become gay or lesbians as adults.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I try to show is because I want us to get out of the intersectional era. I want us to get out of the identity politics era. And there are a number of ways I try to do that. But one of them is just to show this can't work because it doesn't work on its own terms. And one of the major ways that I try to show that is it's not the case that all of these injustices in the world interlock and that if you unlock one, you unlock them all. In fact, they all go against each other in really fascinating and difficult ways. And the obvious one is trans goes against women, undoubtedly. It also goes against men, but let's park men as being an obviously wrong-end group. But it obviously goes against women, and it clearly goes against gay. It goes against gay men and lesbians in the most profound way. And I'm just amazed that more people haven't spoken up about that yet. You know, I think that I had this conversation with Andy No the other week. You know, I think it's the conversation gay men and women have been having in private for a few years now, but they haven't been having in public. I think they should have it in public. You know, everyone can think of young men or women, sometimes themselves, who in this era might have been told, no, you're not just a slightly effeminate young boy, or you're not a slightly, you know, tomboyish, you know, girl. You are in the wrong body. You're trans.
Right.
And you know,
and you're not allowed to challenge that claim.
Yeah, and the parents are told not to be supportive is to risk having a dead child.
Right.
You know?
Or commit suicide. Yeah.
What kind of norm is that to embed?
Yeah. Andrew Sullivan made a comment the other day. I hadn't heard that female sexuality is more fluid than male sexuality, so there's more trans female to male than male to female, and that's going to confuse the equation even more in terms of the reversals.
But the whole thing, by the way, it's very interesting. The people who've challenged me on the maybe gay isn't a totally one-way street thing, even those ones are having to admit that there is more fluidity in female sexuality than in male sexuality, and it's very interesting. But yes, I mean but isn't it interesting that despite that being the case, Andrew Sullivan correctly says the painful ones are consistently the male to female because of the incredibly febrile ways in which that then throws up problems. Cases like male prisoners in a female prison, people who are born men competing in women's sports,
Yeah.
I mean, the obvious one, MMA. I mean, Jesus.
Yeah. As Joe Rogan points out, somebody's gonna die.
Yeah.
I was this. You talked about the track world championships in California. I'm a cyclist, so I followed that. Rachel McKinnon, she was this transition, male to female, and then clean the field out there. And there's now videos online where you see those track and field runners that just decimate the field. That can't feel fair to the women,
No.
and that's another one of these colliding areas. Back in the 90s, I ran a race called Race Across America, a transcontinental bike race, and nonstop, 3,000 miles. I did it in the 80s, and I was director in the 90s, and I had two women in like 93, 4, 5, and 6 who were better than most of the men. And they led the whole race for, several hundred miles. And so we started talking, maybe we don't need a men and women's division with men and women's trophies and men and women's prizes and all that stuff. Maybe just one whole field. Let's be open about this. And so I approached the women and they're like, no, no, we don't like that idea. And I thought, yeah, okay, because by the time the race finished, of course, the men are stronger, they have bigger muscles, and they could last longer, and so on. And there are just certain biological differences that social construction doesn't change.
Yeah.
And then I just wanted to hit on the Rachel Dolezal affair with Rebecca Tuvel. It's just such a classic story of colliding. Well, I think you call it colliding virtues, right? Like in the immigration debate, colliding virtues between, sympathy for Syrian refugees versus, protection of our culture. This is one of those that I can't see how it could possibly be resolved.
No, I'm very interested in that issue. It will possibly shift in the coming years, but the current agreement is you can be transsexual because some people are born in the wrong sex body, but you can't be transracial. And the really interesting thing was, because one of the things I think is fascinating, and what I've tried to do in the Madness of Crowds, is to do everything from the philosophy to the popular culture things, which, let's face it, are if not much more important in the world we live in. And so, and it's quite hard always, as you know, to lasso some of these issues. But I think, as I say in the Madness of Crowds, that it's on The View that you actually get the answer to why we've arrived at the current position we are in, on why transracialism isn't on. And that's when Rachel Dolezal is on the View. The all women, mainly non-white. In fact, entirely non-white, several of whom are black, and they just will not have Rachel Dolezal allowing herself to be black or being viewed as black. And it comes down to a very straightforward thing, which I've got great sympathy for the women in question on the panel on The View. They say, look, whatever you feel like, you have not lived the experience of being a black woman. So no.
Right.
And that is actually where American culture has currently decided to park itself. But the fascinating thing, of course, as you know, is that's precisely the argument that second wave feminists also made against trans, but it didn't work.
Right.
Now, I think here all we see is which societal norms we are more fearful about. Women and women's rights turned out to be comparatively easy to compromise on. In this decade, America is not willing to compromise on the transracial thing because it's not willing to open up the race discussion that would cause.
Yeah.
So, in another country, I mean, I can completely imagine in the coming years other countries where transracialism becomes a more permissible thing, or a thing. But I think America, for obvious reasons, you know better than me, is just not willing to have that discussion. And it's fascinating always where these discussions just get shut down, because they really show what your society really can't do, what it really can't cope with.
Yeah.
And the discussions that are just not worth having.
Well, and a dangerous one, as you point out, is this National Geographic article that posed the question, are Jews white? Holy crap, what?
Yeah.
And, ending white privilege starts with ending Jewish privilege. Wait a minute. Now we're going down a very old pathway.
I'm very interested in this because I've written quite a lot about anti-Semitism in the past, and I'm very interested when ideas slip onto well-recognizable grooves. And I think this is one of the things that white privilege is clearly falling into. I mean, there are cases I cite in the book where this is explicit. Flyers on a campus in the US and more. Yes, that if we're going to play, because we haven't got onto it yet, but the privilege issue is, of course, one of the totally dementing issues of our day, because the intersectionists and social justice warriors want us to spend our lives working out where we stand or sit in the pyramid hierarchy and giving up some of our privilege if we have it. And of course, I try to explain we shouldn't play this game because it's an unwinnable game. It's an unwinnable game.
Right.
People will move up and down the hierarchy in the course of an hour. One of us could have started this discussion at a certain level and have, by the end of it, be at a certain different level. How? I don't know. One of us could say we've got mental health issues now, which we didn't have at the beginning of the hour. I'm just giving it as an example. That's a bit lower down the hierarchy than some others, but it is now on there on the privilege hierarchy, and so all of these privileged discussions, I think, are inevitably going to fall into certain ugly, easily recognizable grooves. One of which is just waiting there on the white one, and you can see it as the article you cite. Where do Jews fit into this? That's absolutely a predictable one. Are Jews beneficiaries of privilege? And let's face it, it's also part of this whole dementing game that is now being engaged in to try to correct the past. Because I'm fascinated. I've written books on history. I'm fascinated by history. But I also know how carefully you have to deal with it. And the way in which we're dealing with it now is dementing. This idea, for instance, that some people are currently owed something because of history. Now, this has got a very obvious, prominent drive in the US for reasons we all know. But you start that game, and what do you end up with? You end up with, among other things, groups that have been treated horribly through history, which everyone decides to ignore.
Right.
And then some, like the Jews, who have not had an easy time historically,
to say the least,
but which the new metaphysics can't help depicting as, in fact, the uber privileged class.
Right.
We know where this goes.
Yeah, we know where that goes. Ultimately, it leads to genocide.
Right.
And
of course, with anti-Semitism, that fascinating thing that Jews can be two things at once.
Right.
Hated for being outsiders, hated for trying to be insiders.
Right.
Simultaneously hated for being rich and hated for being poor.
Right. Yeah. When I was in graduate school in my doctoral history of science program, in 1990, there was a book published called Black Athena. Black Athena. The thesis was that Western civilization is based on Greek culture. The Greeks got their Western, what we call Western culture, from the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were black. I remember reading this going, the Egyptians were black? What? I thought they were red. What? And so much of it was, what did the Egyptians consider themselves? Did they consider themselves black? And the critiques of the book were that's a very late 20th century American question to ask. Were the Egyptians black? They would have never asked themselves that. They wouldn't even been thinking along those lines.
Yes. Well, as you know, I mean, in the race chapter in this book, I try to open this up as carefully, but you might say also brutally as possible, to say, I mean, what do we think we're doing at the moment?
Yeah.
Injecting race into the society, leaning on race as hard as we are now willing to lean on it, making everything about it. Not just the racial studies at American campuses, which deeply trouble me. I mean, maybe again, it needs an outsider to say this, but there's a utility at a certain point in history to black studies, undoubtedly, just as there's a utility in history to gay studies at a particular point. At some point, you've got to see that this actually has all been melded, and rightly, into its proper place in the great river of general thought, general writing, and culture. But once you inject whiteness studies into that, and you have a discipline deliberately designed to problematize a group of people, and then you get the injection of these things into the culture, like the use of the word white as a pejorative.
Right.
Things like gammon start to come in, joking about people's skin pigmentation in a really horrible way. You get into white tears. You get into all of this, and I just think it's very, the whole point in a way of the race chapter is just to say, whoa,
right.
Let's not lean on this like this, because if this is an overcorrection, this is the ugliest potential backlash of all.
Right. There's nowhere forward to go with that. You and I both admire Dr. King and his admonition to judge people by the content of their character, and we're going back the opposite way. He must be spinning in his grave.
Absolutely, it's what I say. The everything has become about the speaker, not the speech.
Right.
It's everything is about the identity of the person speaking, not about the truthfulness of what they are claiming.
Right.
It's such a damn tragedy.
Let's just kind of wrap up here. I know you're pressed for time here. Just a couple of just big questions. How much of a problem is this? In as much as, the arc of the moral universe has been bending fairly jerkily but upwards for 2 centuries, say. And is this a little interlude that we're in? You use the word interlude, that, we've just had a little quirkiness here. And the analogy I use is, I teach at a small liberal arts college, Chapman University in Southern California. And, I'm familiar with all the crazy campus craziness stories you have in your book. And if you watch Tucker Carlson on Fox News, every week he features another nutty, crazy thing. But if you walk around these campuses, you don't see any of this. And it's like, well, where is this happening? And so liberals claim this is a dog whistle by conservatives, that they're creating an issue that isn't really an issue. Most speakers that are invited are not just deplatformed. Ben Shapiro, who we both know, and he has had a few issues on campuses. But if you watch his live streams, mostly he's just given tons of love in these rooms with standing ovations, and he's welcomed by, there's a lot more conservatives, I guess, than we thought. So I guess I just want to get your impression. How much of a problem is this? Should we be super worried? Should we be medium worried? And we just need to, steer the ship a little bit, a little course correction here?
Well, my own view is it's rather like trying to base your morality on Hollywood. Yeah. Basing our understanding of society on American campuses is a dementing and unwise thing to do. They are unusual places, which I have to say, I think, and I try to show, have had some ideas in recent decades that have spilt out into the wider culture, and for all sorts of reasons I go into, have spilt out and indeed then flooded through the general culture, including, I think, to government and corporations. So that is something that people should bear in mind. I think that the American Academy in general has a huge amount to answer for. I think that those people who claim that it's only a few people getting deplatformed here, it's only a few people being drummed out there, it's only the occasional female professor being assaulted for escorting Charles Murray off Middlebury College there. it's just a little bit of hospitalization, nothing to see here,
Yeah.
is a rather dishonest way of interpreting this, because among other things, nobody can deny the stats, which you well know, some of which I give in the book. The stats for just what an unbelievable political skew there is on the American campus.
Yeah.
It's the same in the UK. Among academics, an infinitesimal number have admitted to having voted Brexit. Well, most of their countrymen did. So
Right.
what are we creating in our societies? A priestly class that disagrees with, dislikes, and thinks its job is to correct the general public? Or institutions which actually have a plurality of opinion because they should, not because it's something we're aiming for, but just they should, if they're going to be in receipt of public money and are going to be able to educate the next generation. But I have to say, it's a particularly American problem. When I look at some of the courses that are taught in the US, I'm just astounded. These are non-disciplines. They are students running up debt and their parents remortgaging the house. They become stupider at the behest of a professor who's basically indoctrinating them to become social justice warriors somewhere in their lives. And I just think this is something that American society should have put paid to a long time ago. I mean, particularly when you see the rising level of student debt in America, it ought to have meant that students were trying to get better education, more useful education, and they're not. It seems to me year on year it's worse. And if anyone denies that, then I just think, show me the professor who believes that every year students come up to their college knowing more than the year before, and show me the employer that believes that year on year the students coming out as graduates are just better and better at their subject.
Yeah. I love your final closing paragraph, which I'll read here to close this out. We may certainly aim to live in a society in which nobody should be held back from what they can do because of some personal characteristic allotted to them by chance. If somebody has the competency to do something and the desire to do something, then nothing about their race, sex, or sexual orientation should hold them back. But minimizing difference is not the same as pretending difference does not exist. To assume that sex, sexuality, and skin color mean nothing would be ridiculous, but to assume that they mean everything will be fatal. That's beautiful writing. And that pretty much captures. Just a closing comment. What can we do about this? Besides read your book, of course, that's a good start, and change people's consciousness about this.
Yeah, my aim is to try to do my bit in helping people get out of this. I have a lot of young readers in their teens and 20s who are starting off in life who just have an amazing amount to give and are living at the most fortunate time in human history when our ability to know things is better than it's ever been in history. It doesn't. If you're a bright young man or woman and you have access to the internet, you are the luckiest person in human history.
Yeah.
And what I want is to stop people from engaging in the zero-sum, totally useless, life-sapping game that this generation is being invited to play, to show them very clearly why it's wrong and to encourage them to do something better with their lives. Because it just doesn't seem at all a good use of a life to me to spend it at the end of which you spend so much time navel gazing that you believe at the end of your life you have actually found out what your navel is. Doesn't seem to me to be a useful thing to have done. And I just think we have to get out of this and off this particular train, because there is so much more that young people should be being encouraged to do and so much more that they could do. And that's the point. I want to de-radicalize, de-weaponize these things so that the next generation can actually have lives of meaning which actually contribute in a meaningful way to their era and to succeeding generations.
That's your next book. And we need
There's
more.
At least one book in that.
We need more atheist voices to speak to that ultimate existential question of what's the meaning and purpose of life. Of course, most people get it from religion, but more and more of us, nuns, no religious affiliation, are looking for other avenues, and people turn to Deepak Chopra or The Secret of the New Age or whatever. But surely we could do better than that, maybe.
Yeah, surely.
So, well, Douglas Murray, you're doing your part to change consciousness. For sure, I'm worried. I'm medium worried. I don't think it's an existential crisis. I think it's the kind of thing we can check by better ideas. Again, the counter to hate speech is more speech, not less speech. Thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for your important work. We'll talk to you for the next book.
An enormous pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Douglas.